All right, this is the second half of chapter 12. We're going to start off with the idea of privilege. If you've ever had me in a class before, you've heard me talk about this. Privilege is the unearned advantages based only on one's group membership. The flip side of that then is oppression, which is the unearned disadvantages based only on group membership. So in class, we will clearly have a discussion about privilege and what that includes. Back to this model that we talked about at the beginning of the first half of the lecture, those groups at level 2, the group level differences, those are areas that vary quite obviously in terms of privilege. You can identify quite clearly and quite easily who I think in the US has more privilege and who has less privilege. Again, basically, free opportunities, more given to people just because of their group membership. One of the issues with talking about this is that people that have a lot of privilege often don't want to recognize it. They want to say, I worked hard for this and therefore I deserve it. Again, it's starting to pull in some of those cognitive miser heuristics that basically the whole just world that like, well, I worked hard, so if you don't have it, you must not have. I think it's quite important for all of us to examine where our privilege is and where it isn't. So there are some categories where you might not have privilege, but there are some where you do. As a white man, I have a lot of privilege that way. As a gay man, I have less so in that way. Although that's, again, changed more in recent years, I think. I mean, one of the things that, that I can talk about in terms of just being born into a white middle-class family in Indiana is that I was born into a school district where my parents lived or had a house, and this really rich guy died. And when he died, he left a huge amount of scholarship money so that top performing students from high schools around the area could have a free ride scholarship for room and board and tuition and books to go to Ball State University in Indiana. Now, that's a huge privilege. And some would say, well, you worked hard to be the top of your class to get that kind of scholarship. That may be true, but I did not ask for or earn the right to be born into that school district where that rich guy died. That's a privilege, and that's part of privilege, and that's part of the systemic privilege that happens in the country. That's just one aspect. I'd like you to think about it, and I have an assignment on Canvas for you to consider privilege. So next area I want to talk about is like perceiving and responding to prejudice. Actually, there's something called stigma consciousness, and that is being aware of just when someone is displaying any sign of prejudice towards you or your group. And that actually can also lead, I mean, it can lead to accurate assessment of what's going on, but also lead to stress and also to some health problems too. But it's, I think what they call in terms of being woke is about really having stigma consciousness and being aware of when prejudice is in the room. Typically, it's more common to estimate that one experiences less discrimination than the average member of one's own group. It's interesting. If you look at that, it's related to all sorts of positive health consequences to do that. If you look at, again, you talk about systemic and institutionalized racism and what is happening in terms of privilege, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare availability. You look at the, what is that? I think it's the top 10 killers of Americans. You know, you have heart disease and diabetes and cancer and auto accidents, things like that. You end up seeing that African Americans have tremendous, actually, I think I have 8 out of the 10 leading killers, they have higher death rates. And they have 8 times the death rates of white people. It's even true with the coronavirus in terms of basically what's available in terms of healthcare and who lives and who dies. One area of perceiving and responding to prejudice is this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And you remember the study we talked about where researchers went in and told teachers, this kid's going to do well, this kid's going to do well. That also happens in terms of prejudice. Basically, a person walks into a mixed race interaction and someone who's white has all these racist ideas, and they start treating the person who's black with all these expectations that are negative. Typically, what that's going to pull out of the black person is something that's like not very positive. One study that was done like this, they had white interviewers with black and white candidates, and they just basically said, okay, pretend like you're doing a job interview, and they filmed them. And what they saw was that when they looked at the films, that the judges saw more distance and awkwardness and shorter times that were spent with the black job candidates. So what these researchers did, they went and trained a number of these white interviewers to treat white job applicants in the same way that black applicants have been treated. And when they did that and had them do the interview and filmed it, what they saw was that the way that the white interviews treated these white applicants, just as they had treated the black applicants, resulted in the white applicants performing more poorly, spending less time talking about themselves and talking about what they had to offer in the job. So that is part of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have people engage in those ways, you're going to get the sort of responses that you're looking for. Stereotype threat is something that I think I mentioned before, that Claude Steele, he's a black social psychologist that's done a lot of research with this. It's the apprehension experienced by negatively stereotyped group members that behavior might confirm the negative stereotype. So therefore the stereotype threat. So they had black and white students told that they were going to be taking the GRE verbal test, the graduate record exam. It's like the SAT or ACT. And half the people were told this is still in development. And when the students were told that, there was no difference in performance between black and white students. When black and white students were told this is the real thing from the GRE verbal test, you saw that black students did worse. And so the researchers have been trying to follow up. Why was that? And it has to do with this idea that if you activate the stereotype, that like black students are going to do more poorly on standardized tests than white students, that is starting to be a cognitive distractor for a black student who's going to complete the test. If you're taking a really hard test and you're distracted and you can't focus completely, that's going to impair a person's performance. They found the same sorts of things in a number of different areas, like with women and men in terms of math scores. They tell women and men some very similar things. This is a test that's still in development, or it's a real thing. And when it's still in development, it doesn't activate the stereotype threat for women, and they perform just as well as men on the math test. If you tell them it's the real deal, you see a difference in performance. Claude Steele has taken that into schools and into like high schools and had students, I think I've talked about this before in another chapter, go into universities. And so the black students from high school will go into universities where there are black undergraduate students and have conversations about this very thing, stereotype threat, and help train the high school students to reassess the anxiety that's evoked from stereotype threat, so they can realize, oh, this is what this is. So reappraisal of anxiety. Instead of stereotype threat, when minority students are reminded that anxiety is normal, performance and confidence is increasing, and dropouts decrease in terms of college. Also, identifying with role models is another psychological response. Realizing like, you did it, and so I can do it too. I wish we had more black faculty at Lincoln, or we should. I think that's it's ideal in terms of having role models who are black students can say, this is something that I can get my PhD in psychology, in social work, in whatever, and do this too. Actually, there's research on just self-affirmation. Research showing that if you affirm what your own values are on a consistent basis as you go into a school performance environment, just school, you end up doing better. Just realizing this is the core who I am and affirming that. More responses, identifying with one's overall group can lead to more psychological health. I know that was true. I know I mentioned that, I think in somewhere, that when I first came out, I mean, it was the early 90s, identifying with an LGBT group helped me, like through observational learning and just seeing the pride other people had in who they were, helped me feel more confident in myself. And that was a powerful thing for me. Also discounting, learning to discount the prejudice source. When I first came out, I was in graduate school in counseling, and my supervisor, who was supervising my counseling work, said, "People are going to hate you." And I felt like a slap in the face. I'm like, "Why would you say that?" She's like, "You just need to know it. People aren't going to know who you are, but they're just going to hate you for what you represent." I'm like, "Okay." Um, in the long run, it was more helpful to have been kind of made aware of that. And it's like, and it helped discount the prejudice sources when I encountered them. If you focus on the positive and consider your own strengths, that's another really good positive psychological response. Reducing prejudice. It's hard to reduce prejudice for four main reasons. People's beliefs make the world predictable and safe, so they think. Again, it's cognitive miser. It's like, oh, I know what I believe, and I believe what I believe, and that's right. Prejudice helps to justify the negative bias. And so, again, you can have basically the just world belief. And also people who exhibit prejudice experience an increase in, if they say it out loud, a boost in self-esteem. It's like a downward comparison. Schemas are tough to change, especially because of confirmation bias. You remember that? Excuse me. And people just aren't aware of their prejudice. And at this point, that is not a good excuse for anything, but that's another reason why it's hard to change. Some top-down changes can come from institutions like Brown versus Board of Education, where schools were desegregated, the gay marriage decision. A lot of times there can be some immediate backlash, but typically more legitimization occurs. You think about your own internal process of any prejudice you might have, keep in mind something we've talked about all semester long, that the human brain is a two-step process. You have the reflexive things that come from, sorry about that, that come from our own learning history, and from our families. And so the reflexive reaction is one piece. The other is that we have the prefrontal cortex, where we can evaluate and say, is that true? Is that right? And we can assess that. So having that second ability to use our prefrontal cortex to really start to shift, okay, that may have been a reflexive prejudice reaction I had, but is that true with my values and who I am and the way the world really is, can actually start to lead to shifts of the reflex is less prejudice, and the person becomes more awake, basically. Motivation makes a difference. If it's coming from inside yourself, desiring to be less prejudiced, that's a lot better. If it's from external prejudice, you get reactance, another term we talked about in this class. Contact hypothesis. Does interracial contact worked? Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of studies and some meta-analysis that shows that more interracial contact results in more positive attitudes for white people towards black folks. That's part of the data, but there's more to it. If you're going to have good interracial interactions, there's got to be equal status among group members. There's got to be contact that allows for really getting to know people closely as friends, and so that there's a decrease in that amygdala saying, okay, is this person a threat? And again, going just with that mere exposure effect, that just having this reduced anxiety helps. There's a study talked about in your book, I'm just going to refer to you on the next slide, that's basically sharing common goals, higher goals that everyone in an interracial group can work towards. Means that I'm, back to the last chapter we just talked about, I'm depending on you, you're depending on me, and we're working together, and we have the same core kind of thing that we're going for. And when contact is supported by society, that helps reduce. The Jigsaw Classroom is something I'm going to ask you to look up in your book. It's a classroom setup where if everyone is an integral part of the process of putting together class projects and also presentations, there's a lot that goes on there that helps really decrease prejudicial attitudes among the students who participate in that. Please read about that in your book. This is something I referred to too in a Boy Scout camp in the 1930s, I believe it was. The researchers tried to stoke intergroup conflict between two white sets of Boy Scouts. And the way they helped to diminish it ultimately was to have them all face the same kind of crises and be forced to work together so that they had to accomplish the same goals. Please read about that in your book too. One of the last thing I want to talk about is perspective taking. If you ask people who are in positions of privilege to write about and think about what it's like to live the life of a person who would not have their privilege, that sort of perspective taking goes a long way. Actually, if you actually have them do it, write about it, and take a long time to do that, it's an increase in empathy, a term we've talked about several times. And that actually helps to reduce prejudice amongst the people who typically have more privilege. Okay, that's the end of the second presentation on the chapter on prejudice and discrimination.